Hello and welcome to the Cardiac Cats YouTube channel. Today we'll be talking about a topic that's been gaining a lot of steam again in the past few days, and that topic is whether or not the Jaguars should trade Josh Allen this offseason. So we're going to take a look into his status as a player. We're going to look at how a trade would impact the Jaguars, the pros, the cons, and finally, we're going to look into whether or not this should be pursued. Now, I'll tell you, before we get started here, my opinion is that the Jaguars should hold on to Josh Allen. That's how I feel before looking into everything, and it will probably still be how I feel after. Now, maybe there's some reason we should move on from him, and that's why we're doing this, because as fans, and even for the coaches, it's the same way, all the people in the front office, when we go into this, we have to understand that we can be wrong, and that we need to know the facts before we make our final verdict. And so it's not as simple as either, oh, Josh Allen was drafted early in the first round, he should be a really good player, we have to hold on to him, or Josh Allen hasn't been as good as he should, he's a bust, move on from him. It's not as simple as either of those opinions. And not that everyone has one of those two opinions, but they're two things that I hear. And so, with that said, we're going to go ahead and we're going to jump into it. And we're going to start by talking about this previous season. We're going to talk about what Josh Allen did, what he expected to do as well, and look into some of the reasons for this as well. So, Josh Allen, before the season started, talked about how he wanted to be the best player in the NFL. That's what he said before the season started. That was his goal. And so, obviously, we look back at this season, and he's not the best player in the NFL. There's no conversation on that. But that's what he wanted to achieve. And as his 7th overall selection in the 2019 draft, I think that kind of expectation is fair. I never expected him to be that. I don't think anyone did. But we wanted him to be really great this last year, and we thought he could be. Now, we're going to look at his season. So, we've got here PFF, got all the information on him. We have each week he played. We have all these categories on how they grade him, and we also have all of his stats here. So, to start the year, the first 4 weeks were where Jacksonville was looking really good at the beginning of the year. They started off with a loss against the Commanders, the 2 wins, back-to-back, huge blowout wins, and then a close game in Philly that was impacted a lot by the rain, but they lost that one. And Josh Allen, throughout those games, had 3 sacks to start the year. He had a really good start to the season. He was one of the better players in the NFL. But after that, you see on here, we look at his stats, starting with week 5 in Houston, or at home against Houston, no sacks. And it was that way every single game until we get to Tennessee in week 14. And so that's a huge concern. Now, we're going to look at why things were the way they were then. And so, for Josh Allen, one thing that I know was noted by some people, specifically on Jaguars Happy Hour, Tony Baselli, Pete Prisco talking about this, Josh Allen, the way he looked throughout this period versus the way he looked from Tennessee and on, he seemed like he could have possibly been dealing with an undisclosed injury throughout the middle of the season. That is possible. We're not saying that it was absolutely what happened, but sometimes that happens in the NFL. And the way he looked as a player, he was less explosive throughout the middle of the season. And so that's something to consider. There may have been something going on behind the scenes that we just don't know as fans. And so that's one thing to consider. But I would say the more impactful part of this was the issues in the secondary. Because for the pass rush to have success, the corners need to be able to cover the receivers still. or for the corners to have success, the pass rush needs to get there quick so the corners don't have to cover as long. They're dependent upon each other. And as good as the pass rush seemed, and as good as they graded out, because I think it was either 7th or 9th in the NFL as far as pass rush grade for PFF. Really high on the list for Jacksonville. Despite that, there was not a lot of sacks this season. They really struggled in that department. And I think out of the entire NFL, they were dead last in that conversion rate from pressures to sacks. It's because so often when a player was going to get the quarterback, whether it was Josh Allen or Walker, Arden Key, DeJuan Smoot, any of these other guys, when they were about to get there was always a receiver open. And so a lot of the reason why that was a struggle for this team was because, well, Tyson Campbell was really good outside. Their other outside cornerback, Shaquille Griffin, just honestly fell off a cliff at the start of the year. Just could not have gone worse for him. And I really feel for him because his career just took a complete nosedive this last year for whatever reason. And Darius Williams, who has been an outside cornerback throughout his career despite his size, he was still playing in the slot, where he really has not been that successful as a player throughout his career. And the Jaguars didn't make a change. So for a lot of this season, up until really later on, there was either Trey Herndon or Monteric Brown outside covering these top receivers on teams. And so that's obviously a huge problem. Now, we're going to look at this, and I think you find something interesting with when things changed in the secondary and the correlation to Josh Allen's production. So the biggest change on this team the last year, as far as mid-season adjustments, I think it's undoubtedly Darius Williams moving to the outside on defense. So we're going to look at really where he played, and we're going to look at what week this change happened. So you see, early on, almost every single snap is at slot. And to explain this graph, or this table, you've got all the positions, all the alignments, and then these are the weeks. And then you got the 2 playoff games. So he's playing in the slot the vast majority of the time. You get the bye week here. They moved him out wide against Baltimore. The team was actually a bit more successful that week on defense. And then week 13 moves back into the slot. That's the week against Detroit, where that was really the one blowout game that Jacksonville lost. And then week 14. 59 snaps at outside cornerback and 2 in the slot. And he continues to play there throughout the rest of the year. Now week 14 for Josh Allen. One of his best grades in the past month. Finally gets a sack. And from that point on, in the remaining 7 games, he got 4 sacks. And I believe he had 2 forced fumbles. He was a completely different player from that point on. And so I don't think you can explain everything from his fall off just on the coverage. I don't think you can put it all on that, because players have to be able to overcome that if they're going to consider themselves among the best in the NFL. And Josh Allen right now is not in that category. He's a good NFL player. He's a good pass rusher, but he is not one of the best. He can be. I hope he is someday, but right now he's just good. So another thing I want to throw out there before we move on to really how this impacts the Jaguars if they decide to trade him. You have to understand as well that Josh Allen played a crucial role in 2 of the most important games in the year at the end of the season. Against Tennessee, and heck, even I think the 2 weeks before, he had forced fumbles in all those games. And then against Tennessee at home, returns the touchdown, which credit to Rayshawn Jenkins, he caused the fumble, but Josh Allen returns that for a touchdown. He gets the score that wins Jacksonville the game. The following week, the game that I went to, thank God, fantastic experience to go down there and watch that playoff game against Los Angeles. But Josh Allen was one of the players who ultimately caused the defense to finally step up and break through. He got a big sack when that game was about to get out of control for Jacksonville, to a point where they could not come back. He stepped up as a player. And I mean, you even see in his grades on here, in all those weeks, 92.4, 89.6, 83.4. He stepped up as a player throughout those weeks. Completely different guy from what we saw mid-season. So we have to throw that out there with him. So Josh Allen, as far as his season, it was not as good as what you wanted. And the biggest concern is the complete lack of production in the middle of the season. Now, there were still some plays where he had an impact that won't show up on any spreadsheets. So, like, for example, there was a pressure against Baltimore that caused Lamar Jackson to throw away on a third down in the red zone. They had to kick a field goal. There's plays like that too. And that's for really any player. A lot of players are going to have those that just won't show up on the stat sheet. But still, you've got a lot of zeros in that time period. So that's reflecting on the last season. Now, we're going to talk about the impact that trading Josh Allen has for this team. So, right now, his contract. We've got here our over-the-cap website, Jacksonville Jaguars salary cap calculator. We've thrown on Blake Hance. He is our Calvin Ridley, our placeholder for that, because we can't do this with Calvin Ridley. We have to have his cap number count. So consider this Calvin Ridley. We're $33 million over the cap right now, or at least if we consider Calvin Ridley reinstated, which he will be. So Josh Allen's contract, still his rookie deal. This is what he's being paid for his 5th year in the NFL. Because as a first-round pick, you have a 5th-year option that the team can choose to pick up after his 3rd season. So the Jaguars elected to pick that up. And so now they are guaranteeing all of this money to Josh Allen. He can't just be cut and have all this money simply be saved. As you can see, if we cut him, no change to the cap space. That's all dead money. So the only realistic thing, if you want to move on from Josh Allen, is trading him. And as far as the trade capital, there's a lot of variance in what that could be. Because there was a rumor, it might actually just be a fact, honestly, at this point, with how much it's been talked about and the sources behind it. But the Chiefs wanted Josh Allen on their team this season. They wanted to trade their first rounder for him. And so you had that kind of offer. Now, given that is the last first round pick in the NFL draft this season, that would be 31. So that was an offer they had before. And that was with Josh Allen kind of falling off for a few weeks. And then at the end of the season, obviously, he played a lot better. So as far as the value that you get back, you're probably, I think realistically, you're talking about a 2nd round pick and some later picks thrown in. I think that's what you would get for Josh Allen. And that could be an early 2nd as well. But I'm not sure a team is going to give you their 1st round selection. So that's what you're looking to get back from him. You would save a bit of cap space. So we see if we trade him on here and process that, you're down to about $22 million that you're over. And you've got moves that you can get under the cap space, and you can restructure a few players, and you can have enough money to really spend in free agency. You'll have a bit of money to go actually replace Josh Allen in free agency. However, I'm not sure who you're looking to do that with, that you have enough money for that's going to be as good as Josh Allen. So you're going to bring in someone to help the pass rush in free agency if you move on from Allen. And then in the draft, you've probably got an extra second, maybe some later picks as well. One of your 2 second rounders or your first round pick has to be spent on the edge position. And you've got to get someone who has an immediate impact on the roster. So, in this scenario, if you're trading him away, I think really the best case scenario is that you might have a slight upgrade at the pass rush position, just in that whole entire group in general. You might be slightly better, and that's if you nail it. That's if you get the right guy in free agency and you go get the right guy in the draft. Because I don't know if there's just one player you can pursue that's going to just straight up be better than Josh Allen the first season with a new team. So that's the situation you're in. And obviously, if you move on from Josh Allen as well, that's one less contract that you have to sign the following season. So one less player you got to worry about against the cap space. There's an argument, really, just with the cap space alone for most players. So with that all said, and kind of evaluating what a trade would look like, should the Jaguars trade Josh Allen to another team? I don't think so. I don't think it makes sense for this team, because I think you're doing a huge subtraction to your roster. And if you feel differently, by all means, that's fine, and I think there's arguments for it. But hey, we're going to have disagreements as fans. We're not all going to see things the same way. We're not all going to want to build the roster with the exact same players all the time. There's going to be some discrepancies, but I'm going to give you some reasons as far as what I think a trade would do to this team and why I think that would be bad. And so I think to start, the only reason why he should be traded is if this team is absolutely certain that he is going to start heading in the wrong direction every single season going forward. To me, that is the only scenario where it makes sense to trade him right now, because if you are convinced of that and you are correct that he is not going to be better ever again, that he's going to continue to get worse, then you're selling on him at a high point in his stock, you're getting the most out of him, and you're saving cap space. Then it makes sense. But that's a prediction. That's not a fact. That's only if they are absolutely convinced that they should move on from him and he's going to be worse. And a lot of the reason, too, why I really don't think it makes sense for Jacksonville to move on from him this offseason is because you can simply, as long as he does not just completely crap the bed, for lack of better terms, next season, all you got to do is franchise tag and trade him. Or you just get the compensatory pick and you get something for him. So you're going to get draft value out of him if you don't bring him back after next season. And then you're just paying him about $11 million to play here, which he's worth more than $11 million a season. I think that's fair to say. As a player, like, I'm not sure if we mentioned it before, might have, but he's probably around 15 to 16 million a year as far as value. So you're getting a bargain this year. And another thing too, obviously we expect a lot more from a player who's selected 7th overall in the draft. We want him to be a monster on the defensive line. We want him to be one of the best pass rushers in the NFL. However, if you do not hit that draft pick perfectly, just because it was not the best selection you could have made, does not mean you have to move on from that player. Because all the Jaguars have to do is just say, look, maybe you didn't live up to this, but here's what you're worth. Here's what we can pay you, and work out a deal with him for that. because you've already spent the first round pick. That's already done. I mean, for example, say if Caleb on Chason managed to be a decent rotational pass rusher, if the team can re-sign him for the value of a decent rotational pass rusher, which he is not right now, but say he was, then they should re-sign him for that value. It doesn't matter that he was selected in the first round, because he's not going to be able to claim that kind of market because he hasn't proven he was necessarily worth that selection. So with Josh Allen, the idea that you're paying him $100 million on his next contract, I think is kind of obnoxious, because I don't think he's worth that right now. I don't think he's close to that at this point. And so to me, it feels almost like a straw man's argument to say we're just going to overinflate his value and then use that as part of our argument, because you're not going to be paying him $25 million a year. That's not going to happen. The only way that happens is if he gets like 20 sacks next season. And if he gets 20 sacks next season, okay, maybe we'll pay you $25 million a year. You might be worth that. So all things you got to consider with him. And some of the other issues, just as far as from the locker room standpoint, the team as a whole, I just can't imagine any way they could trade Josh Allen this offseason after how he finished last season, the role he had on this team, the kind of leader he is, and not have some sort of trust issue arise with the players. I can't imagine that happening. Maybe it's not as big as I expect it to be, because the players do understand it is a business. But what do you think happens to Trayvon Walker? I mean, this is his best friend. This is the guy who's supposed to be teaching Trayvon how to play at the edge rushing position. And you're going to trade him away. I mean, look, for example, at what happened when Robert Quinn was traded away from Chicago this last year. And you look at the response that Roquan Smith had to that. It killed him as a player. He didn't want to be there. And he ended up getting traded right after. Now, I don't think Trayvon Walker's going anywhere, right? Like, he's in his second year this next season. But I don't think you're doing something to help him when you're trading Josh Allen. I think you're doing a lot to hurt him. Not emotionally, but just as a player. What he can accomplish on the field, you're taking away a leader to him, his mentor. And all of a sudden, Trayvon Walker has to be the number one guy at that spot, because even if you bring in someone else in the draft, that guy's a rookie. And if you bring in a veteran player, well, first of all, there has to be a good enough veteran in free agency to replace Josh Allen and to do it well. So I see that as a potential issue. And how do we think players would feel if we're going to move on from someone that we considered just before this season to be a franchise building block, an integral player to this team, a player who wants to be in Jacksonville his entire career, a guy who didn't just sit there and complain about what was going on and cause problems for the team when they quite frankly sucked the last few years before they got Trevor Lawrence and Doug Peterson all working together. He was not a cancer here. He stuck it out through all of that. And obviously, as a fan and as someone who appreciates all of that and values it a lot as far as who he is as a player and as a person, I'm going to have my bias. Like, I'm going to probably support him a little more than maybe what is fair. But I still, at the same time, taking aside my bias, I don't think it makes sense for Jacksonville to move on from this kind of player. I just don't. I think ultimately what would happen is that you would lose trust from the locker room. You would lose a little bit of that faith in this team. You'd lose a little bit of what has made this team special. the last year, you're making your edge rush position worse. Your pass rush is worse. The one spot that you have to improve this offseason, that has to have things start going the right way, now you've made it worse. And the only way it's going to be better is if you absolutely nail that position in free agency and the draft. Because if you don't do that, your team is going to be a lot worse and you're not going to have much for it. So that's just my opinion on it. Now, what I think the Jaguars should do, where they're at right now, I think you could absolutely just keep Josh Allen around, see how he is on his 5th year, and then sign a long-term contract if you want him around on this team. And I think regardless of how he does next year, unless it is just horrid, I think he's going to stick around in Jacksonville. I think he wants to. I think the team wants him around. It'll just be a question of how much is he being paid and what kind of role is he in. What we're really going to learn this next season, unless he is traded, is whether he is going to turn into a really good number 1 pass rusher for a team, or if he's just going to be a really good number 2. Because he's one or the other. And that's the question that we're going to have to answer. But what I think they should do, and we did this in a recent video in our mock off season, I think the best move for the Jaguars, and it is a little risky, but I think what they should do now, because I don't see any reason why Josh Allen would get worse, I think you go to him this offseason and you offer him a 3-year extension onto that 5th year option. Offer him about 15 to 16 mil, probably 15 and a half. You throw that on to the 11 million or so that you owe him this season, so your contract is a little under 60 million for the next 4 years. You get him at a really good deal. You backload that contract. You save cap space for this offseason. You spend that. You have a player locked up for the future. And you see what Josh Allen does. You give him that confidence before the year. And I just think it's really unlikely that Josh Allen is so bad this next season that you cannot justify him around that price range. I think that's very unlikely. Because at that point, you're looking at about 14 to 15 million a year when you're factoring in that he's already got 11 million this season, which is considerably less than what he's worth. So that's how I would approach it. And I'm not sure that's exactly how the team will, but I think there's a shot at that. I think from how involved he's been and the way he finished this season after so many things went wrong mid-season, I would re-sign him. I would go ahead and extend him. So maybe I'm a little extreme. Maybe I'm a little too far on the other end of things. But those are my thoughts on Josh Allen. And really wasn't a video I expected to be talking about again, but the last few days, and really just the last week, been a ton of conversation about this once again. About moving on from him, just trying to acquire any draft capital that we can. And so with that happening, I thought I'd give you my input, give you my opinion on it, and take it however you want. If there's any bias in it, apologize for it. I'm sure there is a little bit at least, right? But I appreciate you watching. Thank you for taking your time here. Thank you for supporting this channel. It means a lot to me. This is something I really enjoy getting to do, and I'm excited to continue to do it this off season and continue to do more videos. So thank you for allowing me to do this. Thank you for your time. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and go Jags.